The research station drifted in patient silence above the pale bands of the gas giant. Its long metallic arms stretched toward the planet like delicate instruments waiting to hear a whisper. Inside the station, however, silence rarely survived for long. Machines hummed, diagnostic panels blinked, and somewhere in the ventilation system a small service drone complained, with the faint metallic whine of a device that believed it deserved better working conditions. Reva stood at the central observation window with a tablet in her hand, watching the slow dance of electrical storms far below. Bright blue currents rippled across the planet's clouds like enormous veins of light, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. Every few minutes, the station's sensors captured new data, and every few minutes, Reva frowned at it. "That is not how magnetic turbulence is supposed to behave," she muttered. The drone behind her beeped in what sounded suspiciously like agreement. Reva sighed and rubbed her forehead. The station had been her home for 4 years, 3 months and 17 days. She knew this because the station reminded her every morning at exactly 6 o'clock with cheerful automated enthusiasm, as if exile were something worth celebrating. From the reflection in the window, she could see her own face staring back at her. The long ears extending slightly behind her head gave away her Illyri heritage immediately. Among humans, the feature might have looked elegant. Among her own species, the symmetry was wrong by a few precise biological ratios that her people cared about far more than anyone else in the galaxy. She tilted her head slightly, studying the reflection the way a scientist studies a specimen. "Yes," she said flatly to herself, "truly terrifying." The service drone emitted a small chirp. "Do not flatter me," Reva replied. She turned away from the window and walked across the circular laboratory. Equipment floated slightly off the floor in controlled gravitic suspension. Scanners, spectral analyzers, and 3 devices she had built herself after deciding the original station engineers clearly had very little imagination. Reva loved science. Science made sense. Equations did not whisper opinions about the shape of your face or the angle of your ears. She activated a holographic display, filling the room with floating diagrams of the gas giant's magnetic storms. The patterns had grown increasingly strange over the past month. Electrical currents formed repeating spirals that looked less like weather and more like mathematics, which in Reva's experience usually meant someone very intelligent had built something extremely old and extremely dangerous. "Excellent," she murmured. "Just what every isolated research station needs. Ancient alien mysteries." The drone beeped again. "Yes, yes," she said. "We will probably survive." At that moment, the station's calm, automated voice echoed through the laboratory. "Attention! Incoming vessel detected." Reva froze. Incoming vessel? For a moment, she wondered if she had misheard. The station rarely received visitors. Supply ships came twice a year, and the last one had arrived 3 months ago. The voice continued with cheerful politeness. "Human research vessel approaching docking corridor." Reva blinked slowly. "Human?" She hurried to the central console and pulled up the external sensor feed. On the screen, a small ship drifted toward the station. Compact, slightly asymmetrical, and unmistakably human in design. Human engineering always looked like it had been built by people who enjoyed improvising. Reva folded her arms. "This must be a mistake," she said. The drone whirred thoughtfully. "No one requests transfer to this station," she added. She had been assigned here under the elegant bureaucratic phrase, "remote scientific independence." It sounded dignified. It also meant the Illyri Council preferred she conduct her research somewhere extremely far away. Reva sighed. "Well," she said, brushing invisible dust from her uniform, "perhaps the human got lost." The docking clamps engaged with a distant metallic thud that vibrated through the station's structure. Moments later, the internal doors slid open. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy, confident, and entirely unfamiliar. Reva straightened slightly as a tall human man stepped into the laboratory. He looked around the room with bright curiosity, as if discovering treasure rather than arriving at the loneliest research station in the sector. Then his eyes landed on her. For a brief moment, he simply stared, clearly surprised. Reva crossed her arms. "Yes," she said. The human blinked once, then smiled in a relaxed, friendly way. "Well," he said casually, They forgot to mention the station already had someone beautiful running it. The words landed in the room with the quiet impact of a meteor. Reva stared at him. Her mind quickly reviewed the possibilities. Mockery, sarcasm, human confusion, or perhaps humans simply had terrible eyesight. She narrowed her eyes slightly. Human, she said calmly, either your species has very unusual visual standards, or you are making a joke. The man tilted his head. I'm Paul, he said, and I'm not joking. Reva looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned toward the drone and spoke quietly. I believe the human may be defective. Paul burst out laughing, and for the first time in 4 years, 3 months and 17 days, the research station did not feel quite so silent. Paul continued laughing for several seconds, the sound echoing cheerfully through the laboratory as if he had just heard the most delightful joke in the galaxy. Reva did not laugh. She stood perfectly still, her arms crossed, watching him with the patient expression of a scientist observing an unfamiliar life form that might or might not be dangerous. Eventually, Paul wiped his eyes and took a slow breath. All right, he said. That might be the fastest I've ever been called defective. You should consider the possibility seriously, Reva replied calmly. Your visual interpretation systems appear unreliable. Paul blinked. My eyes? Yes. He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. I mean, they worked fine this morning. Reva walked past him toward the main console and began typing commands into the holographic interface. Data spiraled upward in glowing layers around her. I will run a diagnostic, she said. On me? No, Reva said. On the station's sensors. If they are malfunctioning, perhaps they are influencing your perception. Paul stared at her for a moment before letting out a small laugh again. You're serious. Of course I am serious, she replied. You arrived less than 3 minutes ago and have already made a scientifically incorrect statement. I complimented you. You made a claim. Paul leaned against the nearby work table, looking around the laboratory with bright curiosity. Equipment floated gently in controlled suspension fields, glowing softly with alien interfaces. This place is incredible, he said. Yes. You built half this stuff yourself? Yes. And you've been here alone? Yes. Paul nodded slowly. Okay, he said. That explains the murder attempt. Reva paused mid-command. I have not attempted to murder you. Yet, she turned toward him slowly. You are a very strange human. Paul smiled. I hear that a lot. Reva studied him carefully now. Humans were not completely unfamiliar to her species, but seeing one this close was still unusual. Paul was taller than most Illyri, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that looked slightly disobedient, as if it had refused to cooperate with whatever grooming system humans used. His expression carried a constant hint of amusement, which made Reva suspicious. You still believe your earlier statement? She asked. Which one? That I am... She hesitated slightly. Not beautiful. Paul shrugged casually. Yeah. Reva tilted her head. You have been here 4 minutes. That was enough time. Impossible. Paul pushed himself upright and walked slowly toward the observation window, staring down at the glowing storm swirling across the gas giant. Back home, he said, humans argue about beauty constantly. That sounds inefficient. It is extremely inefficient. Reva folded her arms again. So your species has poor visual standards and poor decision-making. Pretty much, he turned back toward her. But seriously, Paul continued, why would you assume I'm joking? Reva looked at him as if the answer should have been obvious to anyone with basic intelligence. Because my species does not consider my appearance attractive. Paul frowned. He walked closer, studying her face for a moment, not rudely, but with genuine curiosity. Reva resisted the urge to step backward. Huh, he said. That reaction is not encouraging, she said. No, Paul said quickly. I'm just trying to figure out how your entire species managed to get something so completely wrong. Reva blinked. Explain. Well, Paul said, gesturing toward her ears. For starters, those are amazing. Reva stiffened. They are considered a structural defect. Really? Yes. Paul stared at them again. Your people are insane. Reva stared at him. You have now insulted my entire civilization. Correct. And you have been here 7 minutes. Paul grinned. New record. Reyva turned back to the console, trying to ignore the strange warmth creeping into her thoughts. Compliments were easy to dismiss when they came from distant voices in a crowded room, but this human spoke with such casual certainty that it disrupted her usual defenses. She changed the subject quickly. Why are you here, Paul? Research assignment. This station is classified as remote. Exactly. That is not an appealing destination. Paul shrugged. I like weird places. Reyva gestured toward the massive storms glowing below the station. Then you have arrived at the correct location. Paul walked over beside her as the holographic display shifted to show the planet's magnetic activity. Bright spirals of electricity twisted through the atmosphere like enormous living patterns. Paul's eyes widened. Whoa. Yes, Reyva said quietly. That's not normal weather. No. Paul leaned closer to the display. Is that a repeating structure? Reyva nodded slowly. I believe the storms are following mathematical harmonics. Paul looked at her. You think something down there is generating them? Yes. Paul grinned with sudden excitement. So the lonely station above a mysterious gas giant might actually be hiding ancient alien technology? Reyva sighed. Yes. Paul rubbed his hands together. Best assignment ever. Reyva looked at him with mild disbelief. You are excited. Of course I'm excited. That situation could destroy the station. Paul nodded. Yeah, that part's less exciting. Reyva studied him again. Most scientists would be intimidated. Paul shrugged. Most scientists don't get to work with beautiful alien researchers. Reyva closed her eyes slowly. Human Paul. Yeah? I am still evaluating whether you are joking or malfunctioning. Paul smiled. Take your time. And despite herself, Reyva felt the faintest hint of a laugh rising in her throat. The next morning on the station arrived exactly on schedule, which was impressive considering there was technically no morning in space. At precisely 6 o'clock, the station's system lights brightened, the artificial gravity adjusted by a fraction of a percent, and the automated voice cheerfully announced the beginning of a new operational cycle. Good morning, the station said pleasantly. Paul groaned. Already? He muttered from the floor. Reyva paused in the doorway of the laboratory and looked down at him. You slept on the floor. Paul opened one eye. I was conducting an experiment. With gravity. With exhaustion. Reyva considered this explanation. That is not an efficient experimental method. Paul slowly sat up and stretched his arms. You clearly haven't met human researchers before. Reyva walked past him and activated the main console. The holographic display flared to life, filling the room with glowing streams of data. Paul watched the swirling images of the gas giant below. Okay, he said, rubbing his eyes. That planet still looks terrifying. It is less terrifying than yesterday. How? Yesterday you were not familiar with it? Paul nodded slowly. Good point. He climbed to his feet and approached the display. Bright spirals of magnetic energy rotated through the planet's upper atmosphere in slow, hypnotic motion. Paul leaned forward. Those patterns are definitely repeating. Yes. And storms don't normally do that. No. Paul glanced sideways at her. So we're still thinking ancient alien supermachine hidden inside a gas giant? That is the current hypothesis. Paul rubbed his chin thoughtfully. You know, when my supervisor said this assignment might be interesting, I assumed he meant mildly inconvenient equipment maintenance. Reyva folded her arms. You are disappointed? No, Paul said quickly. This is much better. Reyva adjusted the holographic model, zooming deeper into the atmosphere. Electrical currents twisted together into enormous spiraling structures. These storms should be chaotic, she said. Instead, they are synchronizing. Paul stared at the display. Like something is controlling them. Yes. Paul looked back toward the observation window where the planet glowed softly beyond the station. Okay, he said quietly. That's officially exciting. Reyva glanced at him. You say that every time the situation becomes more dangerous. That's my coping strategy. She studied him carefully again. Paul approached the console and began examining the sensor readouts with growing interest. You've been analyzing this alone? Yes. For how long? Several months. Paul whistled softly. That's impressive. It is my assignment. Still impressive. Reva tried to ignore the strange warmth that appeared in her chest whenever he said things like that. Instead, she pointed at a cluster of readings. The storms increase in intensity every 30 hours. Paul leaned closer. And the intervals are exact. Yes, he grinned. That's definitely artificial. Reva nodded. I suspect a buried energy regulator. Inside the gas giant? Yes. Paul leaned back slightly. That's incredibly cool. Reva tilted her head. You continue to react with enthusiasm to dangerous discoveries. Paul shrugged. Science is basically professional curiosity mixed with questionable life choices. Reva considered this. That description is accurate. Paul began walking around the lab, inspecting various instruments. You built this analyzer yourself? Yes. This one too? Yes. He paused beside a floating diagnostic drone. And this little guy? The drone rotated toward him and beeped. That is Station Maintenance Unit 17, Reva said. Paul crouched down. Hello, Maintenance Unit 17. The drone beeped again. Paul nodded seriously. Good conversation. Reva watched the exchange. You are speaking to a machine. Yes. It cannot respond. It just did. The drone chirped again. Paul pointed triumphantly. See? Reva pinched the bridge of her nose. You are an unusual human. Thank you. That was not intended as praise. I'm still accepting it. Paul stood again and walked back toward the observation window. For a moment, both of them simply looked out at the planet. The storms flashed softly through the clouds like slow lightning. Paul broke the silence. So, he said casually, how long have you actually been here? Reva hesitated slightly. 4 years. Paul turned his head slowly. 4 years. Yes. Alone? Yes. Paul frowned. That's a long assignment. It is efficient for uninterrupted research. Paul studied her face carefully. Is that the official explanation? Reva looked back at the console. It is the explanation. Paul did not speak for several seconds. Finally, he said quietly, Your people sent you out here because they're idiots. Reva blinked. You continue to insult my civilization. Correct. And you have now been here approximately 18 hours. Paul smiled slightly. Still breaking records. Reva tried very hard not to smile. She failed slightly. At that moment, the sensor console suddenly emitted a sharp warning tone. Both of them turned instantly. The holographic display shifted rapidly, new data flooding the screen. Paul's eyes widened. Reva? Yes. Are the storms supposed to increase that fast? No. The spiraling currents on the display began tightening into a massive rotating pattern. Paul stared. That looks deliberate. Yes, and it's getting stronger. Reva quickly entered commands into the console. We may have activated something. Paul looked down at the glowing planet again. Well, he said quietly, this assignment just became extremely interesting. Reva nodded slowly. Yes. And for the first time, she was very glad she was not alone on the station. The warning lights across the laboratory shifted from calm blue to a very unfriendly shade of orange. The station's automated voice remained polite, which somehow made the situation feel even worse. Attention, it said gently, magnetic disturbance increasing. Paul stared at the holographic display. Your station has a very calm way of announcing potential disaster. Yes, Reva replied. The designers believed panic was inefficient. Paul folded his arms while watching the swirling storms on the projection. The massive spirals in the gas giant's atmosphere were tightening, growing brighter with each passing second. That definitely looks intentional, he said. Yes. And when something inside a planet starts behaving intentionally, that's usually bad. Not always, Reva said. Paul glanced sideways at her. How often does it turn out to be good? Reva paused for a moment. Rarely. Paul nodded slowly. Thought so. The storm shifted again on the display, forming a larger rotating structure. Electrical arcs flashed across the projection like glowing rivers. Paul leaned closer. That spiral just expanded. Yes. And the energy readings doubled. Yes. Paul rubbed his forehead. Okay, hypothetical question. Reva continued typing commands rapidly. Yes. If that thing keeps growing, what happens to the station? Reva looked at the calculations for several seconds. Explosion. Paul blinked. You say that very calmly. I am used to theoretical explosions. Ah, theoretical ones. Reva tapped another command, and the projection zoomed deeper into the gas giant's atmosphere. The spiraling energy began forming a massive geometric pattern. Paul stared. That is absolutely not weather. No, that's architecture. Yes. Paul looked down at the glowing planet through the observation window. So there's a giant alien machine inside the atmosphere. That is the most probable explanation. Paul exhaled slowly. You know what? What? I love my job. Reva gave him a long look. You may be the only scientist in the galaxy who enjoys discovering unstable, ancient super technology. Paul shrugged. Come on, admit it. This is exciting. Reva turned back to the display. It is scientifically significant. That's scientist language for exciting. The maintenance drone drifted into the room, chirping anxiously as the lights continued flashing. Paul pointed at it. Even your robot is worried. Maintenance Unit 17 does not experience worry. The drone beeped louder. Paul raised an eyebrow. It sounds worried. Reva sighed. It is responding to environmental alarms. Paul crouched beside the drone. Don't worry, little guy, he said. We only discovered a giant alien power system capable of vaporizing us. The drone chirped. Paul stood again. See? Much calmer now. Reva was about to respond when the display suddenly shifted again. The spiral pattern on the projection began pulsing. Both of them froze. Paul leaned forward slowly. That pulse looked synchronized. Yes, like a heartbeat. Yes. Paul glanced at her. Did we wake something up? Reva stared at the numbers scrolling across the console. Possibly. Paul folded his arms. Good news or bad news? I do not yet know. That usually means bad. The station vibrated slightly beneath their feet. Paul looked down. That vibration did not feel theoretical. No. Reva adjusted the sensor range, focusing deeper into the storm layers. The holographic image began reconstructing something massive beneath the clouds. Paul's eyes widened. Oh! Reva said nothing. Slowly, the projection revealed a colossal circular structure hidden inside the atmosphere. Enormous energy conduits extending outward like spokes. Paul whispered, That thing is bigger than the station. Yes. Much bigger. Yes. He stared at the glowing lines connecting the storms to the structure. So the storms are feeding energy into it. Correct. Paul scratched the back of his head. Okay, new question. Yes. If that machine loses control, what happens to the planet? Reva watched the calculations. Large-scale atmospheric discharge. Paul blinked. You mean lightning? Yes. How big? Reva turned the display slightly toward him. The projected discharge radius expanded outward until it reached the orbit of the station. Paul slowly nodded. That is extremely big lightning. Yes. Paul stood silently for a moment. Then he sighed. You know, when I woke up this morning, I thought the most dangerous part of my day would be your coffee. My coffee is perfectly safe. It melted my spoon. That spoon was weak. Paul laughed quietly. Despite the alarms, despite the enormous alien machine hidden inside a violent gas giant, the sound of laughter filled the laboratory again. Reva found herself smiling faintly. Paul leaned against the console and looked at her. You've been studying this for months, he said. Did you ever think it might actually be something this big? Yes. And you stayed here alone anyway. Yes. Paul shook his head. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stubborn. Reva tilted her head slightly. Both are useful scientific traits. Paul smiled. I'm starting to see that. Another vibration moved through the station. The alien machine pulsed again. Paul looked at the projection. Well, he said calmly, looks like the universe just handed us a puzzle. Reva nodded slowly. Yes. Paul grinned. Let's try not to explode while solving it. The station trembled again, a low vibration running through the metal floor like a quiet warning from the planet below. The alarms were still flashing, though the system had returned to its calm voice, as if politely reminding them that catastrophic energy storms were currently forming beneath their feet. Magnetic amplification continuing, the station announced. Paul leaned closer to the console. Your station has the emotional tone of a librarian announcing the end of the world. Reyva did not look away from the data. It is designed to reduce panic. Mission accomplished, Paul said. I am only mildly terrified. Reyva expanded the holographic projection. The enormous circular structure hidden inside the gas giant rotated slowly in the display, its energy conduits pulsing with streams of lightning that fed directly from the surrounding storms. Paul whistled softly. That machine is enormous. Yes. And ancient. Yes. Paul squinted at the energy readings. And currently waking up. Yes. Paul nodded thoughtfully. Okay. That's not great. Reyva typed several commands into the console. New calculations spread across the air in glowing symbols. Paul watched the numbers change. So, he said slowly, are we sure this thing is a power regulator and not a planet-destroying weapon? Reyva paused for a moment. It may be both. Paul blinked. That answer did not improve my mood. Reyva adjusted the sensor filters. The storms appear to be feeding the machine energy. Yeah, I noticed the giant lightning spirals. They follow precise harmonic cycles. Paul leaned forward again. So it's charging. Yes. Paul folded his arms. And when it finishes charging? Reyva looked at the projection for a long moment. I do not know. Paul nodded. That's the scariest sentence a scientist can say. The maintenance drone drifted nervously around the lab, its small lights blinking rapidly. Paul looked at it. Unit 17 is definitely stressed. It is not stressed. The drone beeped loudly. Paul pointed. Listen to that. That's robot panic. Reyva sighed quietly. It is reacting to elevated electromagnetic interference. Sure, Paul said. Robot panic. He walked over to the observation window again. The gas giant filled the darkness outside, its glowing storms now clearly forming vast spirals. Paul placed a hand against the glass. That thing is huge, he said. Yes. You've been studying it for months and never saw the structure before? It was hidden beneath the deeper storm layers. Paul nodded slowly. Until now. Yes. Paul turned around. So we accidentally woke up a buried alien megastructure. That is the current conclusion. Paul grinned slightly. You realize this is exactly how half the disaster reports in human history start. Reyva tilted her head. Your species activates dangerous artifacts frequently? All the time. That is concerning. Paul laughed quietly and returned to the console. Okay, he said. Let's think like engineers. Reyva gestured toward the projection. Proceed. If the storms are feeding energy into that structure, Paul said, then the machine must be designed to regulate the atmosphere somehow. That was my initial hypothesis. So if it's activating now, something probably disrupted its normal cycle. Reyva nodded slowly. Yes. Paul tapped one of the data panels. Could our station scans have triggered it? Reyva checked the timestamps. Possibly. Paul leaned back. Fantastic. Reyva looked at him. You do not appear distressed. Oh, I'm distressed, Paul said. I'm just also curious. Reyva studied him for a moment. Curiosity is a dangerous trait. True, Paul said, but it's also how we stop things from exploding. Reyva considered that. That is logically sound. Paul began examining the deeper sensor layers. If this machine is regulating the planet's storms, he said, then maybe it's detecting some imbalance. Yes, and it's trying to fix it. Reyva watched the energy patterns carefully. That would explain the synchronization. Paul smiled slightly. So the good news is it might not be a weapon. And the bad news? Paul pointed at the projection. It might be trying to correct the entire planet's atmosphere. Reyva blinked. That could generate enormous electrical discharge. Paul nodded. Which means, yes. Paul finished the sentence. Very large lightning. Reva crossed her arms. You appear amused by that possibility. I'm trying to stay optimistic. Optimism is not a scientific method. Paul grinned. It helps morale. Reva turned back to the console and zoomed deeper into the structure's core. Something inside the projection shifted. A new pulse of energy traveled through the enormous machine. Both of them froze. Paul leaned forward slowly. Did you see that? Yes. That looked like a signal. Yes. Paul glanced at her. You know what that means? Reva nodded slowly. The machine is not merely activating. Paul finished the thought. It's communicating. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The giant structure pulsed again beneath the clouds. Paul exhaled quietly. Well, he said, that just made things even more interesting. Reva stared at the glowing patterns forming across the display. Yes. And for the first time since the storms began, she felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, anticipation. The pulse from the machine traveled through the holographic projection like a slow wave of light. Lines of energy spread outward from the massive circular structure buried deep inside the planet's atmosphere, moving through the storm layers in precise geometric patterns. Paul leaned closer to the console. That is definitely not random. No, Reva said quietly. Another pulse followed the first one. The storms responded instantly, shifting their spiraling movement as if reacting to instructions. Paul rubbed his chin. It's sending commands to the storms. Yes. And the storms are obeying. Yes. Paul nodded slowly. Okay. Reva glanced at him. That reaction was unusually calm. Oh, I'm screaming internally, Paul said. But the science part of my brain is very excited. Reva watched the patterns forming across the display. The machine pulsed again. This time the storm spirals tightened into a series of repeating arcs. Paul suddenly straightened. Wait. What? That pattern. Reva examined the projection more carefully. Yes. Paul pointed at the arcs. That's not just storm regulation. No. That looks like data. Reva typed rapidly into the console, isolating the electrical pulses. The holographic display reorganized the signals into cleaner lines of energy. Paul stared. Tell me I'm not imagining this. You are not. The pulses continued forming a repeating sequence. Paul crossed his arms. All right. Yes? If a gigantic alien machine hidden inside a gas giant starts transmitting structured energy pulses, yes, that usually means it's talking. Reva nodded slowly. That is my conclusion as well. Paul grinned. First contact through planetary lightning storms. Reva did not smile, but her eyes reflected growing curiosity. This may not be communication. What else could it be? A diagnostic signal. Paul thought about that. Oh, yes. Paul pointed toward the display. So the giant alien machine might be scanning the planet. Yes. And we woke it up. Yes. Paul exhaled slowly. That's awkward. Reva adjusted the sensor filters again. We must decode the pattern. Paul leaned on the console. You mean translate lightning? Yes. Good, Paul said. That sounds simple. Reva looked at him. That was sarcasm. Of course it was. The maintenance drone drifted nervously across the room, its lights flickering with the electromagnetic interference. Paul glanced at it. Unit 17 looks very concerned. It is recalibrating. The drone beeped loudly. Paul nodded. That beep definitely says, I told you this station was cursed. Reva ignored him and continued analyzing the signal structure. The pulses repeated again. This time the pattern was clearer. Paul leaned forward. Okay, that's definitely mathematical. Yes. Prime intervals. Yes. Paul smiled. That's a classic. Reva looked at him. Classic? Basic universal greeting, Paul said. If you want to signal intelligence, prime numbers are a good start. Reva stared at the pattern. That implies something extraordinary. Paul nodded slowly. The machine is checking if anyone is listening. Reva felt a strange sensation in her chest. For years, the station had been silent, except for machines and storms. Now something ancient beneath the clouds might be asking a question. Paul crossed his arms thoughtfully. So the real question is, Yes? Do we answer? Reyva hesitated. If we respond incorrectly, we may disrupt the machine's function. And if we don't respond? Reyva glanced at the enormous structure glowing beneath the clouds. It may assume the system is still unattended. Paul nodded slowly. And continue activating. Yes. Paul scratched the back of his head. Okay, that's not great. The storms pulsed again. This time the signal sequence changed slightly. Paul noticed immediately. It's adjusting. Yes. It's waiting? Reyva felt the quiet tension building in the room. For years she had worked alone in this station, studying silent data. Now something older than her species might be listening. Paul looked at her. You've been here 4 years. Yes. Have you ever had the chance to answer a message from an alien civilization? No. Paul smiled slightly. First time for everything. Reyva looked back at the console. If we respond, we must do it carefully. Paul nodded. Mathematics? Yes. That's the universal language. Reyva began constructing a return signal using the station's electromagnetic emitters. Paul watched the process carefully. You're sending prime numbers back? Yes. Paul grinned. Classic move. The transmission array hummed quietly. A beam of energy shot downward into the storms. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the massive machine pulsed again. The storms shifted violently across the gas giant's surface. Paul's eyes widened. Yes, Reyva said quietly. That reaction was immediate. Yes. Paul stared at the display. Did we just introduce ourselves to a planet-sized alien computer? Reyva watched the growing signal pattern. Yes. Paul smiled nervously. Well, he said, I hope it likes us. The machine pulsed again, and the pattern that followed was far more complex than the one before. The storms above the gas giant brightened as the enormous machine deep within the atmosphere responded to their signal. New pulses traveled through the lightning spirals, spreading across the planet like glowing veins of energy. The holographic display in the laboratory filled with expanding patterns far more complicated than the simple primes Reyva had transmitted. Paul leaned over the console. Well, he said quietly, it definitely hurt us. Yes. And now it's talking a lot more. Reyva watched the sequences unfold across the projection. The pulses were no longer simple mathematical greetings. They formed layered structures, repeating cycles that shifted gradually, as if adapting to the station's response. It is learning, she said. Paul nodded slowly, like a translator warming up. The maintenance drone floated in a small nervous circle behind them, chirping every time the electromagnetic pulses intensified. Paul pointed at it. Unit 17 is absolutely panicking now. It is recalibrating, Reyva replied. Another storm spiral flashed across the planet. Paul crossed his arms. Okay, honest question. Yes? If that thing decides it doesn't like us, how fast can we leave? Reyva looked at the projection. Not fast enough. Paul nodded. Good to know. The machine pulsed again. This time the signal reorganized itself into clean mathematical layers. Reyva's console translated the structure automatically, reconstructing the pattern as a three-dimensional model. Paul blinked. Oh. Reyva stared at the forming shape. Yes. The pattern displayed a simplified map of the gas giant's atmospheric layers. Energy channels ran through the storms, connecting to the massive regulator buried beneath the clouds. Paul leaned closer. It's showing us how the system works. Yes. And those channels, they distribute excess electrical charge. Paul suddenly understood. So the machine prevents the planet from building up catastrophic storm energy. Yes. Paul whistled softly. So it's not a weapon. No. It's planetary maintenance. Reyva nodded slowly. The storms are part of the system. Paul smiled. That's actually kind of beautiful. The signal changed again. New pulses appeared in the sequence, highlighting one region of the atmosphere where the energy channels were unstable. Paul pointed at the projection. That area looks damaged. Yes. The storms in that region twisted violently, breaking the otherwise perfect spiral patterns. Paul tilted his head. So the machine woke up because something in its system is failing. Yes, and we just answered its diagnostic signal. Reva studied the pulses carefully. It believes we are operators. Paul laughed softly. That's a promotion. Reva began typing commands into the console. If we can stabilize that damaged channel, the system should return to equilibrium. Paul glanced down at the planet. You mean repair a machine the size of a continent? Yes, Paul shrugged. Tuesday, basically. They worked quickly, feeding calculations into the transmission array. Reva converted the repair algorithm into electromagnetic pulses, sending the instructions down into the storms. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the massive structure beneath the clouds pulsed again. The storm spirals shifted. Energy began flowing through the damaged channel once more. Paul leaned closer to the display. Is it working? Yes. The lightning across the planet slowly stabilized. The chaotic storms faded back into smooth rotating patterns, the massive regulator returning to its silent planetary rhythm. Paul exhaled. Well, he said, that was surprisingly successful. The machine emitted one final pulse. This one was smaller, simpler. Reva watched the pattern carefully. It is closing the communication cycle. Paul smiled. So that's alien computer language for thank you? Yes. The storms gradually dimmed, returning to their normal glow. The station lights shifted back to calm blue. The automated voice spoke again. Magnetic disturbance resolved. Paul stretched his arms. I like that announcement much better. Reva stood quietly at the observation window, watching the peaceful planet below. For years she had studied those storms alone, believing her exile was proof of her worthlessness to her own people. Now the same station that had once felt like a prison had become the place where she helped repair a forgotten piece of ancient civilization. Paul stepped beside her. So, he said, how does it feel saving an entire planet's atmospheric system? Reva considered the question. Satisfying. Paul nodded. That's scientist language for proud. Reva glanced at him. You continue to interpret my statements creatively. Paul grinned. That's another human specialty. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the glowing storms move peacefully across the planet. Paul eventually spoke again. You know something? What? Your species was wrong. Reva tilted her head. In what way? Paul looked at her calmly. In every way that mattered. Reva felt the old familiar doubt try to surface in her mind, but this time it felt weaker. She looked at her reflection in the observation window. The long ears her people had mocked for years now seemed different somehow. Not defective, just hers. She turned back toward Paul. You still believe I am beautiful? Paul smiled. Absolutely. Reva studied his expression carefully. There was no mockery in it, only certainty. For the first time in many years, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps the voices that had judged her did not define the truth. Outside the station, the ancient machine continued quietly regulating the storms of the gas giant. Inside the laboratory, the station no longer felt like a place of exile. It felt like the beginning of something new.